The title is fairly straightforward, maybe slightly mysterious. Michelangelo returns and arrives. It's a double return, and the arrival, of course, is both prosaic and a little bit more than prosaic. And the dates are fairly straightforward. Those of you who've been reading your novelized biography, all this will be extremely familiar territory. I try to make it a little bit less familiar, which is to say, all these talks are intentionally a complement to your reading of the narrative of Michelangelo's life and times. They're not a substitute, and so you get a lot more out of all that if you're following his story and the story of his time, his age, etc. So let's dive straight into the mystery here. Now, I suspect one of these paintings is going to be here in New York in a month's time, i.e., one of these early unfinished paintings. This one is less controversial. It's less controversial when we have an autograph sketch in his hand pertaining to the painting, a study. But it is certainly a challenging painting, clearly partaking of the contemporary visual world's probably more of Verrocchio than Ghirlandaio, but with his own inimitable interest. So notice how schematic and collapsed spatially the background is. This is something that is not going to change. It'll be very much a part of his fingerprint. The agitation and movements of the figures are both prefiguring what will be characteristic of all his figures, but the faces are not really very Michelangelesque yet. So we're going to fly by this. There's a very good book by Michael Hirst called the Young Michelangelo, which deals with his earliest works, including these two mysterious unfinished paintings. Okay, so back to Florence. When Michelangelo returns to Florence in when he returns to Florence in 1499, Florence has gone through a major convulsion that he completely missed directly experienced, although through his family and friends, through correspondence, through stories, he was certainly well aware of that, and that was the ecclesiastical polity that Savonarola instituted, and that ended in a giant, actually two bonfires, one that was initiated by Savonarola to cleanse the city of its sins, and the other one which the city initiated to cleanse itself of Savonarola. A very important story, not to be dealt with lightly. Okay, but when Michelangelo returns to Florence, it is to ultimately achieve his second undisputed masterpiece, which is the famous David. So, let's revisit the David that's familiar to us, recently cleaned, restored, consolidated in its glorious neoclassical 19th century setting in the Accademia. How many of you have not seen the David? Oh, well, but you recognize it. It's certainly not a luxury. It has enormous presence for several obvious reasons. One is that it's quite large, as you can see from this photograph. And it is one of those works of art that is, those of you who've been listening to me earlier won't be surprised by my formulating it in this way, but it's one of those few works of art that is artistically perfect. The Pietà was the first, this is the second. Now, of course, that's a much longer discussion, but pretty much everybody who experiences it reacts to its artistic perfection, whether they understand it in any way beyond its immediate presence or not. The Italian kids are gloriously indifferent to it, though. I've been there with massive school tours in the winter where they're all busy texting and chatting with each other with their backs to it. Okay, the setting is quite spectacular. The building was not designed to display the David, but it is a perfect setting for the David. So, as you may have suspected, given my previous lectures, we're now going to look at and try to reconstruct for ourselves its original conception and where it ended up as a result of the vicissitudes of its time. So, if we look very carefully at this image, this is actually a painting of a model, a large three-dimensional model that shows the intentions of the 13th and 14th century artists who were involved in building the Duomo. And this stood outside until the Duomo was finished. And look carefully at the pinnacles. Yes, it started out as Gothic, but in a Gothic building, usually the pinnacles are not sculptures. You see, here the pinnacles are all sculptures. Can you all see that? Well, in the far background of this image, a replica of the David was set up to put it in its original context. So it's way back here. We'll get a close-up. And its original context, of course, was a still unfinished Duomo. This is what the facade of the Duomo looked like in Michelangelo's time. The current facade of the Duomo was a creation of the late 19th century. All the sculptures that you see, or many of them that survived in this image, are in the collection of the Duomo. So here is a night shot view from street level of the David in his original setting. So when Michelangelo started to carve the David, it was intended to be one of a crowd of statues representing the Old Testament prophets. And of course, given that the historical king and prophet David is the ancestor of Christ, he's probably the most significant of these prophets. So, that's how he was intended to be seen, at least when Michelangelo conceived of him and started to carve him. This is where he ended up. As he was finished, and as is often the case in these times and other times, he was appropriated to another project as a symbol of the new republic in the face of all its enemies, both ecclesiastical and more mundane, like the King of France, who was desperately trying to gobble up northern Italy and to take over the kingdom of Naples, which had once belonged to the royal family of France and had now reverted to the Spanish crown. So, there was a committee. The committee got together, and it decided to place David in front of what was then their city hall. The Palazzo Vecchio was not the Palazzo Vecchio back then. It was the seat of government. And later on, a parallel statue, a statue that was meant to complement the David, was set up to frame the threshold to Florence's preeminent civic building. Now, are there two Davids? Actually, there are more than two Davids. But there are at least two marble Davids in Florence. And the second one is a late 19th century replica of the first that was made to save the original from the terrible consequences of sulfuric and hydrochloric acid, which is what acid rain is, and doesn't treat marble very well. So let's go back to our sculpture in the Galleria. It certainly has resemblances to the previous fully in the round male nude statue, which Michelangelo had completed, the Dionysus or the drunken Bacchus. So clearly the naturalism. There's no question that there is a very straightforward naturalism to the figure. In other words, all the muscle groups are doing what they should be doing, given his posture. And what is he doing, by the way? In the story, because he is embodying a narrative. Where is he in the story? Has he killed the Goliath yet? No. It is those moments where he's sizing up his prey, as it were, his adversary, preparing to hurl that rock, which will strategically put an end, or actually knock unconscious the Goliath so that it can be terminated, as it were. So, of course, this is not the first Florentine David. This is to remind you of his great predecessor. Clearly, a much younger David who has succeeded in his task of both putting an end to Goliath by knocking him down and then decapitating him. So this is a triumphant David, and our David hasn't actually won the contest yet. The issue is up in the air. In this sense, it's much more like an ancient statue, because the ancient statues usually are meant to capture a liminal moment on the threshold of action, rather, or a moment, a reflective moment after the action has been completed, but the story is still fundamentally up in the air. So there's no question that he was seeing himself realizing a statue which was going to be at least as good as the great masterpieces of antiquity, and competing with them. Now, what is important to remember is that Michelangelo was actually a bookish sort. This character tends to be lost in the popular presentation of it. But in his youth, in his late teenage years, when he was a part of the Florentine Academy, he was introduced to the one surviving book from antiquity which described his competition, the great artists of antiquity, in other words, Pliny's Natural History. And he was an avid reader of every passage in that book that pertained to the arts of sculpture. So, even though scholarship in his time was not up to giving these names a visual image, by extension from the surviving Roman statues, his imagination took off. Now, of course, it's not just the Roman statues. Michelangelo's lifetime is very much in the twilight of the great days of Florence as the preeminent European city and the crucible for the Renaissance. So he's living in a time when the great pioneering heroes have passed away several generations ago, and of course for sculpture, the greatest of them was Donatello. So, I am putting forward Donatello here. Look at Donatello's face in the great sculpture of St. George, and especially the seriousness of the face, the expression, the brows. And though it's not an identical face, I think one can make an argument that it is clearly Michelangelo's beginning point for his David. It's not the youthful bronze David of Donatello, but in fact the great marble St. George. So just to make the obvious contrast, it's not this face. It's in fact the St. George. Now, when you're in the museum, seeing him at this extreme oblique is probably the best way to study the proportions of the statue, both that way and then seeing him from the far distance as you enter the Academy. Because those 2 points of view are the 2 points of view that our artist is struggling to make come alive. And this accounts for certain proportional idiosyncrasies that are otherwise hard to explain, like the giant hands, which take their place much more naturally when you see them in the oblique. Now, as those of you who've been reading know, a part of the challenge was a very difficult piece of marble that had already been quarried for one of these pinnacle statues, but that had been abandoned, that he inhabited imaginatively. And in the literature, Michelangelo is famous for the statement that he claimed that the figure was already there in the marble, and he was just freeing it from the marble. Well, there again, it's our bookish artists, because that's a statement from the natural history, from Pliny, said to have been uttered by Praxiteles. So, as the heir to this great tradition that goes back in his time 2,000 years, this is the context in which we need to look at his work, because this is how he himself is seeing his work. So he is a great student of the antique. And he picks up certain aspects of it and doesn't other aspects of it. The stylized stones that his figures both stand on and exist in relation to are actually a good example of that starting point from antique representations, both in painting and in sculpture. And this sense of existing in between several actions and this intense reflectivity, very much Hamlet-like, if you want a literary metaphor. Now, we're going to end with the statue that also influenced the statue, but that I want to visit a few other works on the way. There we see our competition, our artistic competition in its original context, although today these are, of course, all replicas. Okay, shortly thereafter, he completes this commission for Madonna, which is now in Bruges, in today's Belgium, which was once a part of the Greater Netherlands. But strangely enough, was for a client that ultimately did not receive it. So this was not its original intended place, but if it wasn't his original intended place, it is spectacularly situated in the cathedral in Bruges, in this wonderful Baroque high altar in one of the side chapels, beautifully framed in this dark marble. Of course, as you know, colors can go strange. No, it's not this reddish orange. It's actually much darker. So there you see it in its setting. There's the exterior of the church. And this is just to put a footnote to where it ended up. Burgundy was once a much larger territory that basically separated the Eastern from the Western Franks. Of course, the Eastern Franks will become our Germans and become the Holy Roman Empire. The Western Franks will become the Kingdom of France, but between them was the Kingdom of Burgundy. And Burgundy has largely vanished off our radar. But Burgundy was, in many ways, the richest and the royal courts which the rest of Europe through the Middle Ages into the Renaissance emulated. They were the source of the ritual of royalty which continued later on into through the end of the Ancien regime into the 18th and 19th centuries. And their art, of course, is the art of the International Gothic, which spread both north and south and east and west. And one of the greatest Burgundian artists is Roger van de Weyden, and this is his masterpiece, The Descent from the Cross, which was from around 1435, but had a huge impact throughout Europe. And I was earlier drawing your attention to the naturalism of the garments, but of course that's simply one supporting aspect to it. Carrying the story through the intensity of the emotions expressed through the naturalism of the bodies in moments of extreme, of their extremity, is clearly one of the great achievements of this masterwork. Okay, back to our Madonna. Intended, like the Pietà, to preside over a religious setting, she is very much in her natural setting, and so the only question, and she's probably at the right height. Let me just move this. So she's going to be conceived of in the 3 points of view. So we're going to look at her a little bit more close up. So you can see that this is the face of the Pietà, but the artist has thought further about it, and she is beginning to develop the features which will be characteristic of his later Madonnas as well. And yes, she's a perfect statue, if any of you are wondering. Okay, so as a part of a side chapel, She's going to be approached either from one or the other of the two diagonals. So I suspect this is the opening view that was intended. And then as you moved across the field of the statue, and that is the closing view of the statue. Okay. Now, at the same time, Michelangelo is invited to contribute 4 supporting figures for a great altarpiece that had already begun in the Duomo in Siena for the Piccolomini family, whose preeminent personage was the Pope Pius II from earlier in the 15th century, or the middle of the 15th century, rather. So there you see it in its intended setting, this spectacular late 15th century masterwork of marble, framing a lovely earlier Madonna. So the sculptures that Michelangelo is contributing are these 4 sculptures on the triumphal arch that frames the niche with the altar. So we zero in on them. So, do you notice anything interesting about them? Would you make these in your own mind contemporary with the David? No, they're much more straightforwardly in the international Gothic tradition. This is an image of Pius II. It didn't start out to be an image of Pius II. It started out to be an image of an earlier pope, but it was refashioned to represent Pius II. On the other side is an image of the famous late antique pope, Gregory the Great. So 2 popes side by side. And below them, St. Peter on the one side, and St. Paul. St. Paul is the one with the most obvious contrapposto and the most immediately recognizable as participating in Michelangelo's evolving artistic interest. They're contemporary. So I don't know what the order of their carving is, but they're all within the same, they're probably all being worked on at the same time. And there we see it, quite beautiful. Of course, you notice that the great shell operates as a kind of halo over each one of them. Yes, and at about the same time, he is working on 2 marble tondi, which is 2 round iconic images of the mother and child. This is called the Pitti tondi because it ended up in the Pitti Palace. It's from 1503 to 1504. So towards the end of this, of his sojourn in Florence, sadly unfinished. And we'll say a few things about what this means. Here's a bronze casting of it, which I include just because it highlights aspects of the composition. Now, do you see the evolving face of the Madonna? And notice her headdress. This will continue in his later Madonnas as well. the ornament with the curious figure in the center. No, we have no drawings of any sort. We just have this mysterious tondo and an even less finished one, which is contemporary, maybe slightly earlier. This could be one that he'd been working on, or they could be exactly contemporary. This is even less finished than the previous one. This is called the Taddei tondo. Currently residing at the Royal Academy in London. The other one is in Florence, as I mentioned, at the Pitti Palace. Of course, to people who work in marble, it's a fascinating document on how he's approaching the sculpture, and yes, very much in the manner that he's emulating from his reading of the ancients. It does very much look like the figures are being liberated from the encasement of the marble. And who did this little sketch? Well, actually, it's his younger contemporary, younger by only 8 years, although in our minds perpetually young because of its early death. It's Raphael. At the same time that Michelangelo had returned to Florence, the young Raphael had arrived in Florence, and clearly he was paying attention to what his older contemporary was up to. And so this is a sketch of this tondo, the Taddei tondo in Raphael's hand. So this is this bronze casting captures more of the composition, I think, than the other one did of the other tondo. And then, yeah, sadly, we have to fly through all this stuff because we've got other things we need to see today. Okay, so perfect masterpiece number 1 is the Pietà, of course. Perfect masterpiece number 2, indisputably the David. And this is the third one, called the Doni tondo, because of the family that seemed to have commissioned it. And the subject matter, it was started about this time, but finished after he returned to Rome, somewhere around 1506. This is his one complete panel painting, and it's tempera and oil. And the fact that the colors remain so vibrant has a lot to do with the fact that it's principally tempera, which is then glazed over. So, in this trajectory, what is one of the obvious things that we're looking at here? What is the aesthetic driving force behind this conception? It's sculpture, right? This is a realization of a three-dimensional sculptural conception through the medium of painting. And it is riveting and also very odd. Okay, what's the most obvious odd part? Those naked figures in the background. The clue, of course, is in the way the composition is disposed in the middle ground. There you see it in its frame, and it is very likely that Michelangelo also designed the frame. So we're looking at Michelangelo's interest in intense ornamental, architectural ornamental work, which will continue, and we'll see some spectacular examples in the further ones in the coming week. So there are four prophets, and the figure at the top, the fifth figure, is an image of the mature Christ. Okay, so as I said, it's split into two, right? The upper part of the background is a scene that seems to have not very much to do with what's going on in the foreground, except for the in-between figure. And can anybody guess who the in-between figure is? You can always tell who he is by his garment, even when he's shown as a putti. It's St. John the Baptist. So, yes, this is fairly straightforward, no point in creating bigger mysteries where they need not be. In the background, we're looking at the ancient world. In the foreground, we're looking at the new dispensation, and through his glance, traversing those two, is the last Old Testament prophet, St. John the Baptist. So, the narrative is the composition. And it doesn't have to be obscure. Ultimately, its success has everything to do with everything else in this composition, obviously. And the figures between the foreground and the background are knit in various ways. Of course, the Christ child is a mediating figure, right, between the foreground and the background. But there's also extreme contrapposto, spiraling contrapposto, which is already become Michelangelo's signature. This is a rather large tondo. Now, I've left out until this point the other great artist, the older contemporary of Michelangelo's, Leonardo Da Vinci, who also has subject matter which is very much within the same religious cultural horizon. And here is his study for his great The Virgin, the Child, and Saint Anne, which will sadly remain unfinished, partaking in a similar world. And this is the sadly unfinished version in the Louvre today. So the study is contemporary. Actually, the study is slightly earlier, and Leonardo was in Florence at this time, so Michelangelo is very likely to have been aware of it. Michelangelo was very, very aware of the greatest people around him that he was very competitive with. And then, of course, the fruits of these two in their most careful and brilliant of students, Raphael, that brings together the streams, the artistic streams coming both out of Leonardo da Vinci and out of Michelangelo. This is a few years later, 5 years after the Michelangelo Tondo. This is called the Alba Madonna. But of course, radically different moods. If you remember from the movie, The Agony and the Ecstasy, Raphael is introduced at a few key points in that story, but in such a way that it elides over the fact that Michelangelo was already very familiar with this guy that was haunting his footsteps. Okay, so to give you a sense of the scale of this spectacular painting, and its current setting in the Uffizi, usually a crowd of people. Yeah, they're right to be there, crowding around it. And of course, as I was pointing out last week, it's a part of a tradition. The great paintings of Botticelli, most directly this one probably. and its ultimate fruit will be Raphael's great late masterpiece, the painted towards the end of his life, the Madonna della Segnola, which lives in the Pitti Palace. So I've put it in it's not a huge painting, but it's beautifully presented along the enfilade of the planetary rooms designed by Pietro da Cortona. So, another perfect painting that has learned a lot from this perfect painting. Okay, meanwhile, Michelangelo is working on another large statue in Florence. He's known as the St. Matthew, often with quotation marks. Even less finished than the two Tondi. Hard to photograph because when you photograph it from head on, it tends to flatten it. But this sculpture directly influenced the contemporary St. Catherine of Alexandria by Raphael. So this was painted at the same time as Michelangelo was working on this sculpture. And we know that Raphael studied it carefully because we actually have a sketch of his studying different aspects of its potential characterization. Of course, potential because he's reading into something which is yet to be realized. So, with here you can see the signature posture of Michelangelo is already being explored by the Raphael, who is entering into his maturity now, sadly, to be terminated within 12 years. Okay, so when you stand on the side, you can see how dynamic the sculpture is. So let me just say a few things about unfinished. Do we know why this sculpture is unfinished? Well, actually, yes, we do. He was called to Rome by Julius II to work on his tomb. So, he dropped it. He did not return to it. So, the non finito. I don't know how many of you have been to the Met recently, but there is sort of a modest to large Rodin show in the gallery that will lead up to where the Michelangelo exhibit is going to be on the second floor. And clearly Rodin's work is operating deliberately within the Michelangelo non finito. Rodin encountered Michelangelo's sculptures about 1/3 of the way through his career, and they very much formed the artistic horizon of all his subsequent work. So Rodin is operating within the deliberate non finito, but is Michelangelo. Now, a careful reading of his biography, which is somewhat represented in the novel, you discover that Michelangelo was the one wage earner in his rather extended and grasping family. So Michelangelo, every penny he earned went to satisfying the various projects and resolving the various economic and other crises of his brothers and his parents, and later on his nephews. Which means that if he wasn't getting paid for something, it's very unlikely that he would have continued working on it. He would be looking for the next commission, which will give him cash flow. Now, I know this puts it rather prosaically, and we want to see these works as somehow metaphorically unfinished, but it's highly unlikely. He was constantly looking to his next challenge. Now, the next work, which is contemporary with these, that will remain unfinished also because he was called to Rome, is the great battle painting, which was being painted for the principal hall of the Republic in the Piazza Vecchio. It's the Battle of Cassina, started and worked on around 1504. We know this from a couple of good, careful replicas. When he left, the cartoon for the central portion of the battle had been completed and was ready to be transferred to the wall. And this cartoon survived for a couple of decades into the 16th century, and thanks to people like, this is Bastiano da Sangallo, this is realized around 1542 while Michelangelo was still alive. We have the composition. Of course, the source of the composition is this relief sculpture from his days at the Academy, the Battle of the Centaurs. And so he's showing a moment in the battle when the Florentine troops are relaxing, bathing by the river, and then they're surprised and they have to collect themselves and fight off the enemy. And on the other wall, talk about direct competition, you have Leonardo. And if Michelangelo is carrying the narrative through the human bodies, Michelangelo is through the clash of equestrians, and especially these very agitated horses. This is from a drawing that was based on an engraving by Rubens. Yeah, that's right. And that's the setting, of course. This is a lovely 18th century image of the Palazzo Vecchio and the civic center of Florence. And where is all this? Where was all this intended? In this huge room that was commissioned and built during the time of Savonarola to embody the new Florentine Republic. It's still there, although with much later and less consequential paintings. And there you see it in its hall in plan. So under Savonarola, the building was expanded, and this huge hall was introduced. That's the foundation. There's the floor plan of the hall, and the hall moves through all the stories of the volume of the building. And we have a number of, actually about 10, surviving sketches at various phases of the development of the composition, which are certainly well worth studying. Maybe some of them will be here come November. This is one that lives in the Ashmolean in Oxford, a spectacular little sketch. Here's a larger one, which is already working out the eventual composition of the cartoon. And we have this figure developed fairly highly in brown ink with gray-brown wash, heightened with white, with a stylus. This one usually lives in the British Museum in London, quite possibly. We'll see it. And you can see who it's this central figure, which Michelangelo is studying in some detail in its final posture as it ended up in the painting. Okay, so who called him to Rome and terminated several of these projects? Possibly both Tondi, certainly the great fresco, and also the St. Matthew. It was the new Pope. We're not seeing him as new. This is the Pope towards the end of his life, as painted by Raphael. It is Julius II. Now, the Rome to which Michelangelo is returning to. Remember, this is the Rome that he just left 5 years earlier, is of course late medieval Rome, the Rome of the 1,000-plus year Basilica of St. Peter's and all the other monuments, many of which no longer exist. And that was the Rome of the then great presiding figure, none other than the infamous Pope Alexander VI, who we know as the Borgia Pope. Here is a portrait of him. Now, the Borgia Pope and the Della Rovia Pope are very similar. Both had one gigantic challenge that they had to overcome that was dealt with both in identical and in slightly different ways, which is that they presided over a principality, the Papal States, which had gone onto its, which had decomposed to the point that every one of the little cities was ruled by a local strongman, so that Urbino had its own independent government. Bologna was also independent. And so the Borgia Pope, through his son Cesare, and the Della Rovia Pope in person, campaigned to bring an end to these spasms of independence and to try to reunite the Papal States into a coherent, well-working principality where everybody paid the same taxes and contributed to the independence of that principality vis-a-vis all the other greedy principalities which surrounded them. And all of this is brilliantly studied in Machiavelli's great work, The Prince, for those of you who've taken some political science. Now, artistically, Rome is behind the times. Artistically, this is Rome. This is an enunciation from about slightly earlier, but from about the same time, also from London, from the National Gallery. So Rome is deeply within the latter phases of the International Gothic. And it's in that context, among others, that we need to see the Pietà. So in terms of subject matter and piety, completely within the horizon of the International Gothic, and yet in terms of its artistic realization, clearly attempting to participate in the antique Roman world. So, this world, the great Pietà of the Roman world was this mysterious statue which goes under three possible subjects matters. It's usually called Menelaus carrying the body of Patroclus, sometimes called Ajax carrying the body of Achilles, and less often Priam supporting the body of Hector. Okay. Whichever one it is a supreme, it's actually a Roman copy of a Greek original, probably bronze, of around 200 BC, a Hellenistic work. And it is the great Pietà of the ancient world. And the best preserved version, also partially reconstructed, is the one in Florence in the Loggia di Lanza. And we're looking a little bit forward, but Michelangelo will ultimately be returning to this kind of composition in his last two Pietas in marble, as we'll see. Not exactly International Gothic. One of my favorite St. George's. This is by Carlo Crivelli, closer to Donatello than to Michelangelo. And yet, Donatello is also keenly alive to the Roman. Okay, so as I showed you before, this is a picture of Rome in 1500. As it were to summarize it, this is the reality of Rome. It is a city of perpetual pilgrimage. It's obviously a 19th century painting, not a Renaissance painting, but a spectacular painting by Oswald Achenbach, painted in 1905, showing pilgrims on the way to Rome. And you see St. Peter's in the far distance and ruins along the way. So we're returning to Rome. This is the reality of Rome, basically until the 20th century. This is a procession around the corner from where Michelangelo will eventually find his permanent residence and where he will die. On the this whole series of buildings was demolished in the around the turn of the century until the around 1900 to create a space for the Victor Emmanuel monument, but it's in that site that Michelangelo's residence was, plus that of his later artistic follower Pietro da Cortona. And here we see a pilgrimage to the church of Santa Maria in Arcocelli. And that's what it looked like in the 18th century with Michelangelo's stupendous Campidoglio. So Michelangelo lived in a house somewhere right there. And at the time that he had returned to Rome, literally within a couple of months of his returning to Rome, this spectacular sculptural group was discovered. And on the day that it was discovered, Michelangelo was called over to bear witness to the discovery and to begin to draw it. This is a later drawing from the 16th century by Federico Zuccaro. I believe you have a replica of one of their books that Anthony has as a part of his collection. And it's a beautiful evocation of it, although here it's the older Zuccaro drawing the Laocoon when it reached its eventual destination in the upper terraces of the Belvedere. The Vatican Palace is shown in the background. So, yes. In the meantime, while Michelangelo was away, another great artist from the north had arrived and had produced what everybody at the time considered to be the perfect building, the so-called Tempietto up at the Spanish Church of San Pietro in Montorio. This is, of course, Bramante. And his client was, well, he had two clients, the Borgia Pope and the two patrons of the Borgia Pope, of course, Ferdinand and Isabella. And this was the alternate Vatican. So I don't know how many of you know the story, but the Tempietto was supposed to represent the place where St. Peter was martyred, and it's based on an ancient passage which says that St. Peter was martyred between the two, and they translated this word as pyramids. So there are two pyramids, or there were two pyramids in Renaissance Rome. One of them is still surviving in the southern part of the city. The northern one was right next to the Castello Sant'Angelo. If you took out your calipers, more or less, and intersected the two radii, around this spot on the other side of the Tiber was the putative place that said that St. Peter was martyred. The problem, though, is that the Latin term that is used, that is translated as pyramid, are in fact those pyramidal sculptures that were at either end of a spina in a circus. So in fact, the ancient text is telling us that St. Peter was martyred in Gaius's and Nero's circus, halfway between the two pyramid groups at either ends of the spina, which is to say that he was martyred right under the obelisk. You know that obelisk that was moved in the 16th century and is now in the middle of St. Peter's Square? And really, you need a monument there. I don't know if the current Pope is going to commission a monument for, he's not big on commissioning monuments, but anyhow. But nonetheless, it gave us this masterpiece. It too is unfinished because it was intended to be the center of a circular courtyard that was supposed to represent, you know, when you drop a pebble in a still piece of water, the radiating energies, as it were, spreading out into the world. We have a 16th century drawing which describes this design, and here's a lovely wooden model of the Tempietto in the Royal Institute of British Architects building in London, showing us this conception. There's a 16th century drawing of the Tempietto, and it becomes the Temple of Athena in Federico Barocchi's great painting of Aeneas fleeing burning Troy. The other new building and the other first true Renaissance building in Rome at the same time is, of course, the Cloister of Santa Maria dell'Apache, also by Bramante. So Bramante is working for the Borgia Pope, and as we'll see, and let me just finish quickly here, as he then becomes the architect for the new St. Peter's. Well, it didn't happen overnight, because when he became Pope, like a lot of popes, he became Pope way too late, basically 20 years too late. He wanted to succeed his uncle, Sixtus IV, and there we see the young cardinal with his uncle. There's the future Julius II. There is Sixtus IV. But a number of other popes intervened, most especially the Borgia Pope. So, when he came onto the throne of Peter inside a basilica that looked very much like this, and we have sadly not enough, but just enough evidence to reconstruct it. So, example, sketches of the late antique Apse mosaic, which two versions of it which have survived, which allow us to visualize it. And there's the plan. Remember, somewhere in one of these niches is the Pietà. The Borgia Pope wanted to start building his tomb. Sorry, not the Borgia Pope, the new Della Rovia Pope, Julius II. His tomb was his first project. That's how Michelangelo was called to Rome, which is to say, he was called to Rome before the beginning of St. Peter's. Where was the tomb going to be situated? Well, at this point, because of the revival of the Roman Church in the 15th century, St. Peter's was horribly overcrowded with pilgrims, and this transept, the Constantinian transept, which was designed for vast crowds of pilgrims, was hopelessly insufficient. And so about 50 years earlier, a project to enlarge the transept had been begun under Nicholas V, and in fact the foundations were largely laid. And the intention was to move back the apse to create a choir and to increase the size of the transept by about a third. So this is the earliest drawing associated in Michelangelo's hand for a tomb for the new Pope. The original lives at the Met, although rarely on display. Hopefully they will reveal it to us when we're visiting it in a month's time. It's the first project, and what's key is it's a project for not a freestanding tomb, but a wall tomb. Against which wall was this intended to stand? Its inspiration, of course, is directly the tomb for another pope, this one from Florence, designed by Brunelleschi and executed by Michelozzo and Donatello, the tomb for the Pope John the 23rd. So that is the partie. The other type of wall tomb that was current in Florence at this time, this is a good example of it, is the tomb of Carlo Marsupini by Desiderio del Setagno in Santa Croce in Florence, which is towards the end, actually just a little bit later after the... Okay, the two other tomb types that Michelangelo is familiar with, I showed you last time. We don't have to dwell on them. And here we have the earliest drawing for the new project for St. Peter's, which shows us both the Constantinian Basilica, the new foundations, and the eventual first project of Bramante. So these are the foundations we're talking about. So they would have obliterated, they did actually eventually obliterate the chapel that Michelangelo's Pietà was in. So these foundations were continued by Julius. So the Pietà got moved very soon after it was set up. And guess where he wanted to put his tomb? Right here, on axis, behind St. Peter, which would have meant that it would have dominated the long view. Now, if that isn't hubris, and Michelangelo participated in it, Michelangelo did a lot worse. He said to Julius, in effect, not grand enough. The greatest tomb monument of antiquity was the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus. That gave us the tomb of Mausolus at Halicarnassus. That gave us the word mausoleum. And how did he know about it? From Pliny, from the natural history, which gives us a description of it. The ancient tomb was realized by the ateliers of four of the greatest sculptors of the age, one of which filled the tomb with literally scores of statues, close to 100 statues. So Michelangelo proposed that, and I'm just showing you that I'm going to rotate the drawing, that right behind the altar, right here, Julius built a freestanding tomb, and in less than 10 years, he promised him 40 statues on a freestanding monument. And the best reconstruction is this one, which would have been a little building with relief sculpture and freestanding sculpture. This is the first design. This predates Bramante. So what happened? Well, even Julius thought, I like it, but it can't really be there on axis. And what was the solution? A new St. Peter's, so that it could be moved to one side. I kid you not. There is a later project from about 10 years later that captures some of the ground story of this project, and we'll return to it. In the meantime, one of the members of Michelangelo's Atelier, Antonio da Sangallo, who will succeed the St. Peter project eventually, Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, did a project for a tomb in the 1530s, which is a more compact version of the original conception that actually was realizable, although it was never realized. However, Antonio da Sangallo did realize a very similar design, but not for St. Peter's, but for the sanctuary of the Sacred House in Loretto that encases the Sacred House. These are two of the facades, and here we see it in its setting at Loretto. So, in principle, it was realizable. It's just that one sculptor couldn't do it, and you needed more than 4 or 5 years. Okay, so instead, they began this huge project of St. Peter's, replacing the Constantinian Basilica. And actually, what was Michelangelo's starting point? It was the tomb of Sixtus the Fourth meeting the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus. This is the tomb of Sixtus IV. It's now in the basement of the Vatican. It once used to live in its own chapel. There's a drawing of it. So imagine this raised to a massive 3-story building. For a while, it was in the Chapel of the Blessed Sacrament in St. Peter's, but sadly, in the 20th century, it was banished. So, in a nutshell, this is what Bramante proposed. Why don't you move your tomb to a big chapel next to the choir, and some future pope can build a tomb there. And meanwhile, essentially, the ambition of the sculptor triggered the imagination and ambition of the client to go way beyond empirical practicality and begin the mad project, which will take up the next 100+ years of building a new St. Peter's. And the trigger was this young whippersnapper reading Pliny the Elder and having visions of the glories of antiquity revised, and we'll return to this next week. So that's how St. Peter's got started. And those of you who've read the novel, and of course the next project is the painting that he did finish, the big one, of course. Okay, to be continued.